and get rid of that transcript, and I've lost my notes. No, back again. Okay, folks, so the course structure today, then what I'm going to cover, I'm going to look at why meetings are important to you as an employee and to an employer. And we will have a look at what makes an effective meeting, some of the jargon around meetings, and that's going to be quite general because obviously there will be jargon in different companies and businesses that I can't cover here. There'll always be something new for you to learn. But very importantly, the do's and the don'ts of meetings. And I want to talk to you about finding your voice at meetings. It's not easy for many people to speak up at meetings. So if that is you, you're very much not alone. And then I'll finish with some examples of possible interview questions, sample interview questions. So I want to start with why I've put the session here in the first place. As I said, you're probably not going to be asked specifically about meetings, unless, of course, your job is to organise them, and that is entirely possible. No matter what type of job that you do, there's usually meetings to be organised. But the main reason is to help you to have confidence about what's expected of you at meetings, not to feel too nervous about going to them. Because I know that many people do not like to have to attend meetings. I'm not keen on them myself. And for many, it's because they can be boring and time wasting, but it's also because it can be a bit nerve wracking. So you might not have any experience of formal meeting structure or jargon, and that can be challenging as well. So we'll go over some of that. But meetings are one of the places that you get a chance to impress and to influence people that you maybe don't necessarily have access to in your day-to-day work. So often those people can be senior, maybe from different departments, and it gives you a chance to create a good impression with people who could be influential in your career. So you may well be the most junior person at the meeting and possibly the newest to the company. You may be there representing your department or your project, and you might have to present to the meeting or make your case or even fight your corner in the meeting. So if you're new or the meeting is covering many different topics, you might not have a clue about what is actually being talked about. You might not understand the office politics, and you might be surprised by the company culture because that's often very obvious at meetings. Sometimes it's only in meetings when people come together that you really see how people behave and interact, and not always in a good way, and it can be quite eye-opening. But it can also be quite challenging to be in the midst of it. And of course, for some of you, it can be difficult to speak up at meetings. And many people do dread the thought of having to speak at meetings. I know this from training that I've done, just from speaking to people, coaching that I've done. So if you are someone who thinks I'm not keen on speaking at meetings, believe me, you are absolutely not alone in that. Generally, people feel that way because they're more introverted in nature. Perhaps they're shy or perhaps they're inexperienced. So we'll talk a little bit about speaking up at meetings. You might not love speaking up, but you can cope with it. So what I thought I would get you to do is we'll talk a bit later about what not to do in meetings. And I wanted to give you a chance to begin to think about what not to do in meetings. So I'll address this later on, but it would be great if you could start to put into the chat what you think you shouldn't ever do in meetings, and we'll address it then later on. So let's start with, does it have to be a meeting in the first place? And do I have to go to it? I was at an event a few years ago, and the then student president, not the current student union president, but the one a few years ago was there. And he said that he was on 40 different committees. I couldn't believe it, 40. I was absolutely horrified because every committee means numerous meetings, and constant meetings are tough. So before you call a meeting, consider if it really needs to be a meeting. People spend an awful lot of their time in meetings. And if you've been in work for a number of years, you will find that people, are always complaining about the length of time that they have to spend in meetings. Sometimes they do not have to be there at all. Maybe the meeting doesn't concern them enough for them to be there. So consider, are the wrong people being asked to the meetings? Sometimes it just takes a lot of time and wastes a lot of time. And sometimes, if it is just giving people information, it could have been done in another, quicker, and probably more useful format. And the use of more online meetings technology has facilitated more ways of sharing information without actually having to meet. So, meetings are expensive. Each attendee is away from their work to attend the meeting. I know it's part of their work, but in terms of actually meeting objectives, you're often away and not being able to do that. So if the meeting is badly controlled, then it can lead to conflict, going round and round in circles, maybe getting nowhere. And if comments after the meeting include things like, well, that was a waste of my time, that's an hour I'll never get back, or I really needed to be working on something else, then you know that it was a badly organised meeting that probably should not have been a meeting at all. So, your first step in terms of meetings is, should it be a meeting in the first place? Is that the best way to communicate? Because meetings can be so time consuming and very static, some companies have tried out different ways of doing meetings. Now, obviously, we do an awful lot of our meetings online these days, but before that, there were standing meetings and walking meetings. Now, stand up meetings are generally daily update meetings where a team meets to go over progress of tasks. My husband, who's a software engineer, has an online version of these, but they're called scrums. And I often think I really would not like to be invited to a morning scrum. But you know, that's the new jargon that you learn whenever you start a company. Um, the fact of them being standing meetings, although of course now they're sitting meetings, means that generally they're shorter because people don't have the comfort of sitting. And I said earlier that we can spend a huge amount of our time sitting in meetings, and we know that that's not very healthy. So some companies now get around that by having walking meetings. It might be a 20-minute walk in the park where you brainstorm ideas for something. It would no doubt be more informal and it might allow for more creativity. It won't work for formal meetings. For any sort of big numbers, it won't work if you need to have papers, etc. Maybe if you need to take a vote. And certainly if you have the wrong shoes on or if the weather is bad. So imagine arriving for a meeting in your high heels with a briefcase full of papers or a laptop and told that you're going to have it as a walking meeting instead, just to freshen things up. You can see that it wouldn't always work. And you need advance notice if the meeting is going to be anything out of the ordinary. So for the most part, people tend to fall back on the more usual type of meetings and hope that there will at least be a decent cup of coffee at it. Not always the case by any means. So efficient, effective meetings then. An effective meeting should leave you energized and feeling that you've really accomplished something. And in order to feel that it was an effective meeting, it will generally meet the three criteria. An effective meeting will achieve the objective that it was held for. So you need to know what that objective was. And you need to have communicated that to the participants. So do you want to reach a decision? Do you want to generate ideas or get a status report? Either way, the team members need to know what the objective is so that they can actually achieve the objective. Number two, then, the meeting is kept as short as possible. Things are kept streamlined. You stick to the plan for the meeting, the agenda, and you don't get sidetracked. And people are held to time so that somebody isn't hogging the meeting. People are prepared for the meeting. They have the right information on time. And the meeting is started on time so that you don't recap for latecomers as well. And the meeting needs to be managed. Usually there's a chairperson doing that. So the conversation is kept on track. Everyone gets a chance to speak. No one person takes over the conversation. The items in the agenda are summarized and action points are noted for following up. So that's, three sort of things that you can consider if you're having to answer something about what makes an effective meeting. So just to have a look at some of the meetings jargon, and I don't really want to focus on the structure or the formality of meetings, but rather on how to be your best at a meeting. However, you can't really do your best at a meeting unless you understand the formality of it. So I want to touch on some of the jargon and just a wee bit on the formality of meetings. And obviously somewhere like Queen's, which is, a huge organisation, at least in Northern Irish terms, and there's a lot of very formal processes. So we'll not go into that sort of level, just a general sort of meetings jargon. So depending on where you go to work, most of your meetings will probably be less formal, but there are also many occasions when meetings are very formal. So it's best to be in the know about them. There isn't really much to it, and you'll probably already be familiar with it. So you start with the agenda, which is basically the plan for the meeting. The minutes, which is the written record of the meeting, taken by an agreed minute taker. The chair, who is formally in charge of the meeting and has the role of managing the proceedings. And another term then, action points, which are basically just agreed in the meeting. And it's basically who agrees to do what by when. So not too much in the way of jargon there. But let's put a little more detail around that. And this detail will go into the PDF for you folks. So, you don't need to be taking notes or anything. It'll all be in there for you. So the agenda, as I said, is basically the plan for the meeting. It's based on the objectives for the meeting, and the participants should see the agenda in good time before the meeting so that they know what to expect and can prepare for it. It might be as informal as a few bullet points in an email, or if it is a formal meeting, it might be fully laid out with, and again, I'll put this into the PDF, the date, the time and place of the meeting, the name of the person leading the meeting, the chair, the purpose of the meeting, any apologies perhaps that you already know about, the names of the attendees who could not be present at the meeting, a reflection on the previous meeting's minutes and discussion of any sort of matters relating to the previous meeting where appropriate. It's not always in there. The main agenda items for discussion, and these should be prioritised with the most important item coming first. And if it's a formal meeting, they should have a time allocated to it. So you know that you've got, maybe 20 minutes to speak on that particular subject. And that's just to keep people to time and ensure that all the agenda items get addressed. Because often if it's not kept to time, things that are at the end of the agenda have to follow on maybe to the next month or the month after. However, this is generally only used for formal meetings. And it would finish with any other business, the date and time of the next meeting. This might actually be agreed within the meeting itself. And the agenda should be circulated ahead of the meeting with any relevant papers that you expect people to read ahead of actually attending the meeting. Anything you expect participants to read before the meeting, often people get things and there's a lot of information to read and they'll maybe just skim through things. So if there's something really important that has to be read beforehand, that should be identified. The minutes then should be taken by an appointed minute taker during the meeting. That's often somebody who's not actually involved in the meeting itself, but just there to take the minutes. They're circulated then among all the attendees and interested parties, maybe 2 or 3 days after the meeting, depending on the nature of the meeting. The minutes should capture some or all of the following aspects of it. Again, if it's a very formal meeting, then there's often a specific requirement for the minutes. I think I should say that probably most meetings that you attend won't necessarily have any minutes taken at all, but any sort of committees or action groups or project groups are likely to have minutes. So the minutes would include things, obviously the date, time and venue of the meeting, the name of the person leading the meeting, usually the chair, the names of all the attendees, the agenda topics covered, and note if there were any not covered, the definition of problems, issues or challenges discussed, the alternatives or solutions presented in the meeting, details of any decisions made, the agreed action points, the persons responsible for delivering them, and the timescales or the deadlines identified. So again, who is going to be doing what by when, and the date and the time of the next meeting. The minute taker then should record them in whatever way is easiest for them, as long as it's not distracting to the attendees at the meeting. And the minutes are a record of the key discussion points and the outcomes. They're not a word for word record of it. And I would say if you are the person responsible for writing up the minutes, my advice is to do it as soon as possible after the meeting, because it just gets harder to remember what happened in the meeting. So do it as soon as you can. The minutes are sent out to the participants after the meeting, and then at the next meeting, participants are asked if they agree that the minutes are an accurate record of what happened at the previous meeting. So that would come up as an agenda item. So I've kind of, skipped through that quite quickly because, as I said, it is all in the PDF and you can read through that there. Okay, so let's cover any recommendations from the chat about what not to do in meetings. Have we got anything in there, Patricia? Any suggestions?
Yes, indeed. There were a few suggestions coming in about, and all good ones too, about not fidgeting, talking over people, or using your phone.
Classic.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that, folks. All good ones, as you said, Patricia. Okay, so remember that this is about you as a meeting attendee, not as a meeting organizer. So it's all about your behaviour at the meeting. So I'll go through some of these, and your answers, your suggestions are absolutely very good. In fact, I don't think I have fidget there at all, so that's a good extra there too. So don't show up unprepared. People will take note if you consistently show up unprepared at the meeting. So think of the impression that that gives to other people. They're all busy too, and if they've prepared, then you should have prepared as well. Think about why you're being asked to the meeting. What is your role in it? What is the most valuable contribution that you can make to the meeting? And also, if you consider the cost, I said that, meetings are very expensive. Imagine the staff member who's 15 minutes late, but the meeting can't start without them. So everyone that's at the meeting is being held to that person's timekeeping. So don't show up late. Likewise, if the meeting goes ahead and you miss the first 15 minutes, then chances are you will have missed the most important discussion. Because as I said to you, if an agenda has been prioritised with the most important items first, then that is what you miss. And people can't afford the time to catch you up. So you may even have been given action points at the meeting, and you may have missed that entirely. Often whenever you're not there, that's the time that you will be given the action points. So the first thing that you might know about having to do those actions is when you read the minutes, possibly, a few days, a few weeks later after the meeting. So if you know that you will be late, then, because that often, it happens, then let the organizer know beforehand if you can, and apologise and say why. And then quietly join the meeting and apologise if you get the opportunity, but don't make a big hoo-ha of coming into the meeting. Likewise, sneaking in looks bad, and having to start a meeting by apologising makes you feel bad. So it's not a good start for you. So essentially, be on time for the meeting. It shows your professionalism and your courtesy to the rest of the meeting attendees. Don't tune out when it is not your turn to speak or it's not your topic. It can still look quite selfish. Other people are going to see that you've tuned out. Other selfish behaviours would be no eye contact, as somebody mentioned earlier, being on your phone, because, even if you have it under the table, people know what you're doing. Any sort of side conversations going on while someone's actually trying to present or talk at the meeting. Even clattering on your laptop, it might even be something to do with the meeting, but it's, not necessarily a good thing to be doing in the meeting either. Don't slouch and yawn. The difference between letting people know that you're engaged and interested or disrespectful is, that body language that you're giving off. Good posture makes a good impression. Don't eat or drink inappropriately. Don't be the person to bring in, an egg and onion sandwich or something. Um, Normally, water and coffee are acceptable to drink in meetings. And obviously, if food is supplied at a meeting, then that's entirely different. But you bringing it into the meeting yourself, you have to think about what impression that is giving. Okay, so check if it's fine to bring in food, if it's a lunchtime meeting or something, because often the smell of food and chewing sounds can distract other people. So it's best to leave the food for after the meeting if you can. If it's a lunch meeting, eat quietly and also always clean up after yourself. So don't walk away and leave rubbish behind you, especially if there's a bin close by. Don't make excuses. This is sort of entirely a different sort of thing, but don't make excuses for your questions. When you ask a question, just ask it. Don't precede it with, I know I should know this, or is it okay if I ask a question, or this might be a stupid question, but because you can hear that, you're already showing lack of confidence whenever you do that. So when you proceed your question with qualifiers like those, you're telling people that you aren't confident. So ask your question directly without excusing it. Don't repeat what others have said just to be heard. Um, you know, it, Sometimes it's good to be able to say things just to have had your voice heard. But try to come up with something that's actually relevant to the meeting and new from you. Another don't is don't hog the floor, because you do want to hear from everybody at the meeting, and you don't want one person just to take over. So one person, no one wants to spend more time in a meeting than they have to. So keep your points to the point. Don't use your mobile device. Definitely have your phone on silent. A phone call during a meeting is a no-no. It does happen. But if you have your phone on silent, just to be respectful to other people. And also, no one wants to listen to your notifications pinging away as they're sitting trying to have their meeting. And absolutely do not scroll on your phone or other devices during the meeting. Even answering work emails, and you know that people do that in meetings. We can see people doing it in online meetings as well. But just in terms of you making that good impression, then it's one of those things to try and avoid as well. It's all about making sure that you look like you're engaged in the meeting. Don't be afraid to speak up, but we'll do that one separately later on. And don't leave early for exactly the same reasons that you have to arrive on time as well. And finally, generally, just try to avoid distracting behaviours like, oh, and I did have fidgeting, tapping pens, swiveling your chair around, rustling papers, humming. You might not even know you're doing it. But believe me, other people will know it. So be conscious of your body language and, just be respectful of other people in the meeting. So there's quite a lot of don'ts there. So let's get on to the what to do then. So let's have a look at what you should be doing when you're attending the meetings. And as you can imagine, a lot of them are the opposite of the what not to do. So first of all, know why you're attending the meeting in the first place. What are the objectives of the meeting? What do they want to get done? Why specifically have you been invited to it? What is your role at the meeting? And do your preparation. So have you read the minutes of the previous meeting? Have you done the actions that were assigned to you? Have you read any papers that were sent out for the meeting? Are you representing your department, for example? If so, what you can do you know what you can commit to, or what the opinion of the people in the department is? So you'll have to have done your background work before you actually come to the meeting. The meeting organizer, for example, might ask for attendees to come to the meeting with suggestions or ideas around a topic. So make sure that you are fully prepared for that. and show up on time. We've already covered that really. So I've already said why it's important not to be late. It is disrespectful and time wasting. However, there are also advantages in being a little early, and I do mean just a little bit early. It's often when people from within a department or across different departments or companies, even depending on the meeting, get a chance to socialize a little and build relationships. And that's an important part of being in meetings and representing your department and stuff. You can also often get a sense of office politics and also what the opinion is on the topic that you're going to be meeting about. So even before the meeting starts, you might have a good idea of how people are thinking about it. Present yourself appropriately. Chances are that for internal meetings, how you dress in the office will be, fine for any sort of internal meetings. However, if you're having an external meeting or you're meeting with clients, just check what is expected of you. You don't want to be the one who turns up in their jeans if everyone else has suddenly donned a suit. So just be aware of what's expected of you. And be positive. So it's important that even if you have concerns or queries around the issue, or you feel negatively about the issue that's being discussed, that you present those concerns in a positive way. You don't want to come across as being constantly negative about changes or issues. That's not to say that you don't voice them, but you're careful about how you voice them. Be mentally and physically present. So take your turn speaking. Write down your main points if you think you might forget what you want to say while you're waiting, but try to continue to listen to the conversation even while you're writing or even when it's not on a topic that you're, specifically involved with. And be a good listener and keep an open mind. So a meeting will be productive if the participants listen well to other people and actively participate in discussions. You can show that you're listening by looking at the person, nodding appropriately, asking specific questions. Just look engaged basically, and ask open questions to inspire other people's thinking as well as your own thinking. You do want to stay on track, so don't waffle or go off the subject, but do communicate your ideas. And I think it's important to choose an appropriate time to ask your questions. It's fine to ask questions in this meeting at any time that you want to, but I would say if you're in a meeting, whether it's online or it's in person, try not to leave all your questions to the end whenever people are already starting to wrap up the meeting. They won't give you the time needed, for the questions. And if you have concerns about an issue, make sure that you're talking about the problem and phrasing it in such a way that it feels or that it doesn't feel like an attack on the person who suggested it. So, it's about the issue, it's about the problem, not about the person. So you might say something like, that's an interesting suggestion, but maybe we need to think about. Okay, so you're keeping it positive. You're not sort of saying that's a stupid idea or whatever. Okay. Be aware if you're being given action points to complete and be clear about what those are and what the deadline is for them. Ideally, you'll want to be seen to build relationships and to collaborate with others because that's part of what meetings are about as well, or at least it's part of what some meetings are about. So now I want to move on to speaking up at meetings and why it can be difficult. And some of you will know why it can be difficult if you're already feeling that way. But it can be very unfamiliar. So formal meetings are usually just something that starts in a work sort of environment, unless maybe you're part of a committee or something here. And indeed, it can be a very useful sort of training ground for work. A lot of people don't join clubs and societies and go on to meetings, thinking about that, but it can be really useful experience for you going into a work setting. It takes a while to become familiar with the style of meetings in a particular company that often are different from one company to another. You might be unprepared, and that might make you feel that you don't want to speak up, perhaps because it's not something that you know a lot about, or perhaps it's just something that you've not taken the time to prepare for. And in a meeting, you are on show. It can feel quite exposing, I suppose. Your manager might be there, your line management. Meetings are often where other people judge your capabilities. They're not necessarily getting a report from you, they're listening to what you're saying. And that might be the first chance that people have to listen to what you have to say. So you may do a lot of good work behind the scenes, but unless you're able and willing to tell people about it, they won't necessarily know that. Everyone else is experienced and they all know each other. And that might be how you feel about it, that everybody else has experience. I'm very new, they all know each other, and I don't know them. And the experience thing can be difficult, especially if you disagree with someone that is more experienced than you. And by that, I mean more experienced in terms of being in the company for a long time or having worked on a particular project or something like that. But in those sort of circumstances, it can be very hard to speak up and to say that, especially if you do feel like a newbie. And there may be obvious conflict going on in the meeting, or you may sense that maybe there's tension between some participants or topics that people know is going to be contentious. You might just want to keep your head down and say nothing. And sometimes that might be the best thing to do in some cases. And another reason, it can often seem like everyone else is perfectly fine with speaking up. And I guarantee you that that will not be the case. Um, but, even people that are uncomfortable will have learned to do it with effort and practice because it's an important thing to be able to do. So don't assume that just because people are speaking in meetings that they're necessarily comfortable doing it. You don't know what's going on in their head, just as they don't know what's going on in your head. So assume that if you're in a meeting with a number of people in it, some of them will actually feel a bit anxious about speaking up. It won't necessarily just be you. So a little bit then on speaking up at meetings. Now, one of the reasons that I included this topic in the employability skills sessions is because I was talking to one of the staff that deals with students on work placements in companies, students who maybe go out in their third year to do placements. And they were telling me that one of the things that company hosts comment on is if a student has been strong or poor in meetings. And things like being prepared, making notes, speaking up, and engaging tend to come up regularly. So it's an opportunity for you to, and as I've called it, impress in your meetings. And it doesn't necessarily have to be very hard to do that. So we know that it's important to attend well and to be engaged. But if you look at what I've just said, there, about attending well, only one of the points is actually about speaking up. So you can do all of that other stuff, the making notes, listening to other people, looking like you're engaged, being prepared for the meeting. All of those things are about impressing in meetings, not just speaking up. So even if you can do all of the other stuff, which, as I said, will give you, improve your reputation and your credibility, even if you find it difficult to speak up. So make sure that if you're going to meetings and you know that you're not going to be able to say anything, whether it's because you have nothing to say or you're shy about saying it or whatever, at least look like you're engaged and you're attending and you're interested. And that alone will give you some brownie points. So I've already said that meetings are a place that gives you a chance to influence other people. And that is, not just by your skills and your experience, but also, as I've said, by your behavior. So if you've been invited to a meeting, then the expectation is that you will take part in the meeting. So all of the things that I've said in the do's and the don'ts slides are very important. But many people find it hard to speak up at the meetings. They feel maybe that they haven't got the experience that other people have, or they may be an introvert and speaking is not, something that they particularly like to do or the way that they prefer to behave. Now, while some good meeting leaders will know this and will encourage everyone to speak, others will ignore this, and sometimes only those who speak loudest and speak longest get heard. So we know that, and that means that often that the very valuable thoughts and ideas of those maybe quieter individuals are often lost. And I'm not going to say that it will suddenly become easy to speak up at meetings. If it's not how you naturally behave, then it can be difficult to overcome this. And I'm not going to make light of that. But I will say that, it's possible for you to be able to overcome maybe that uncomfortable feeling and speak up as you need to with practice and with experience. And as I said, many of the people sitting in the same meeting will be dealing with and overcoming the same thing. You'll already be aware that when you're in your lectures, it's often the same people that put their hands up and ask questions or answer out whenever a lecturer asks a question. And that will be exactly the same in formal work meetings. It's usually the same people that do a lot of the talking at them. But you don't want to blend into the background at work. You want to be able to showcase yourself. So it's important that you do learn to speak up at the meetings. So the first thing is to remind yourself that you will not be the only person in the meeting feeling that way. To some extent, you don't have to worry about how you're feeling inside. Only only you will be aware of that. Okay, so whatever you're feeling on the outside, as long as you can look engaged and interested, people won't necessarily know that. So the key is to make yourself look like you are perfectly confident. So keep eye contact, look engaged, actively listen. People only see what's going on the outside, and they don't know if you're quivering on the inside. Okay? So before the meeting, make sure that you've done your preparation so that when you go into the meeting, you're as knowledgeable as you can be. I've already said to you, turn up on time for the meeting. But actually, if you're nervous, I think it's a good idea to turn up a little bit early. Not very early, a little bit early, because it gives you a chance to speak to people as they come in and make sure that you do speak to them. It's much, much harder if the first words that you say at the meeting are whenever you're put on the spot to come up with your suggestions or an idea or something. Far better that you've actually already had a little chat with some of the colleagues beforehand as they've been coming into the meeting. So certainly in Northern Ireland, it's very easy to talk about the weather. You can always say, oh, look at that day, if you haven't met people before. Just be friendly and approachable. Okay, introduce yourself. If they don't know your name, ask them if they're busy in their department. Just it only has to be small talk, but at least it means that you've already sort of spoken to a few people before the meeting. It can be a good time to form relationships with other people as well. And you don't, the first words that you say in the meeting aren't whenever you're put on the spot. So I genuinely think that it's a good idea. Arrive a little bit early and chat to people as they come in, even if it's just a good morning or a good afternoon or something like that. If you're new to a company, then be prepared to introduce yourself in the meeting. You might get, the chair, for example, saying something like, and I'd like to welcome John to the meeting today. John, would you like to say a few words? And that might absolutely flummox you if you're not expecting that. So be prepared if you're a new person to introduce yourself to, any sort of meetings that you might be in. It might be just something like, hi, I'm John. I've just started in the marketing department. I'm working with Roisin on the new website project. I look forward to working with you all, something like that, but just something that you can have prepared. If you have it prepared so that it's not a shock to you. And if it is a cross-departmental meeting, then you should also be prepared to introduce yourself in the meeting and to be able to say a few words about the department or about the particular work that you're doing. That's something that you have to do quite regularly as well, especially in a large sort of company. Once you've already spoken in the meeting, whether it is just a small, talk at the beginning or introducing yourself, the ice is broken and it's much easier to speak up again. So have confidence that you have been asked to join the meeting for a reason. Even if it is, a team meeting or something, you're there as, you're there as part of the team as much as everyone else is. You have something to offer. Even if you're there to learn, and, aren't we all really, then you can use the team meeting to ask relevant questions. And asking questions are a good way to show that you're engaged without having to put forward your views if you're nervous about putting forward your views. So sometimes just being able to ask a relevant question will make it look like, yeah, this person is contributing to the meeting. You may find it easier to add your agreement to someone else. For example, you might say something like, I was very impressed by what John had to say. I'd be very interested in exploring a bit more about that. Okay, so you're not necessarily saying what your new idea is or anything, but you are engaged and you are commenting. So it's a good way to be able to add yourself to the meeting. It can also be easier to say something quite early on before things get, going strongly, and you might not get a word in edgeways. So again, don't necessarily leave it to the end of the meeting. If you're going to speak, then speak loudly enough. When you speak during the meeting, make sure that everyone can hear you so that you don't have to repeat yourself. It makes you appear confident and professional. And I'm not talking about shouting here. I'm just make sure that everyone can hear you. And of course, if you are speaking in the room, just like if you were giving a presentation, make sure that you look at the rest of the people in the room so that you're getting them to engage with you more as well. Take notes and, just make sure that you're looking engaged all of the time. And note your questions and summarize your thoughts so that when someone stops speaking, you might get the opportunity to ask your question and you don't lose your train of thought. So when you speak, keep it short and to the point. If you need to put it into context or give some background so that everyone there understands it, do that first. So you could also prepare a thought or a question before you go into the meeting. And if you're suddenly asked, what do you think? Then at least you've got something prepared. Okay. And you can use the agenda to maybe give you some ideas about what sort of questions that you might want to ask. So put a couple of bullet points down, and then you know that you've got something that you can say if you're approached to say something. So if you want to plan what you could say in a meeting, read the agenda beforehand, think about a couple of questions or a couple of points that you would like to make, and then it's easier to do that in the meeting. The preparation will give you some confidence to speak up. Okay. And then virtual meetings. So just quickly on virtual meetings. I suppose when I was preparing this session, I was generally thinking more about meetings in real life, sitting around a table with other people. But actually, most of my meetings these days are online. And while most of what I've said to you will still apply for online meetings as well, there are also some other considerations whenever the meeting's online. So curate your background and your desktop. So we all know that it's important that your background is, reasonably professional, and that includes your lighting and all the rest of it. Luckily, most meetings aren't recorded like this thing. But sometimes when people have to share something on their desktop, everything that they happen to have open on their computer appears. So make sure that you curate your desktop as well as your background before the meetings. Dress appropriately, at least the top half, but don't get caught out. You have to remember that you're on camera and behave appropriately. And for meetings, I know a lot of people don't put their camera on, but certainly for a small meeting especially, you should really, be prepared to put your camera on. Don't eat in a virtual meeting, especially if you aren't muted. People tend to forget that paper rustling and chewing is a lot worse whenever you're hearing them in your headphones rather than at the other end of the table. At least you don't have to contend with the egg and onion smell, but the sounds of it can be just as bad. So if it's appropriate, mute your microphone, use a headset. And it's even more appropriate that you follow meeting etiquette online. So, it's more likely that you interrupt people because you don't sort of see that someone's about to start speaking whenever you're in an online meeting. So use the sort of facilities that are there. Put your virtual hand up or put a question into the chat rather than, interrupting people. And if you do that, because sometimes it's hard not to do that, at least apologize for doing it. And do remember that the chat is usually a public space, so be very careful about what you put in there. Show that you're listening and engaging with the meeting by staying off your keyboard and avoid multitasking where you can, at least. And do be careful that you haven't got a funny filter or something like that on before you go to the meeting. Were you the last person to use the computer? Okay, so that's the topic itself finished, folks. You're welcome to start putting any questions in that you have. I'm just going to move on to the STAR technique then, in terms of interview preparation. So the STAR technique is basically about effectively answering your interview questions. Basically, you want to be able to tell the interviewer your story by putting your answer into context for them, because you need to do that because they can't do that for themselves. So when you're formulating an answer for your interview, try and follow this STAR technique. It makes your answers clear and logical and coherent, and it means that you're getting across the main points that you need to. So start by listening to the question. Think of the example that you're going to use. Hopefully you'll have already prepared a good example. But even if you're thinking on your feet, frame your answer into situation, task, action, and result, and describe the event or the situation that you were in. Explain the task that you had to complete. What were the challenges? Describe the specific actions that you personally took to complete the task. You can say what you did as a team, but you should also say what you personally did because it's you being interviewed and not the team. And finish with results. So what was the results of your actions? Were there benefits? Was there any sort of savings? What was the impact? Okay, so that's the STAR technique. And then I just wanted for any of you who don't already know about Shortlister. Whoops. So Shortlister is basically an online package that you can avail of. It's on our careers website, and Patricia will put into the chat a link for it. It basically is an online package. You're not going to be dealing with any real life people. You can choose which interviews that you would like to do. I would ask you, if you register for an interview, you have about 3 days then to complete the interview. So go ahead and do it because it's really good practice. A lot of interviews are being done like this online now. You can choose different jobs to go for or different roles. Okay. And as I said, it's there for you. It's available for the time being anyway. It's only about 5 or 6 questions per interview. And the important thing is that you get feedback on how you did. Again, it's automated feedback, so you're not interacting with anyone, but it's a good interactive quality experience. So I think Patricia's probably just put that link in there for you. And it's a good opportunity for you to practice your interview skills. So let's move on then to actual questions that you might be asked. So I did say to you that this isn't necessarily a topic where you'd be asked specific things about meetings unless you're going to be organising them, but you might get asked things around how you operate in a team and things like that. So what preparation do you do before attending a meeting? And that would be about, what the meeting is, what the meeting is for, what your role is in it, read any of the papers, complete any action points, go through the agenda, ask maybe others for their opinions if you're feeding back information, that sort of thing. So we've talked about all of that preparation. What would you take into account before organizing a meeting? So first of all, the main thing is, does it have to be a meeting in the first place? Does it, is it online or is it an in-person one? Who needs to be there? And then the logistics, like, how long will it be? What time will it be at? The place, the location, that kind of thing. How would you run a team meeting? And this one is also about things like making sure that everyone knows why they're there, encouraging everyone to speak at the meeting, sticking to an agenda, having an action point allocated to people, making sure that they know what those are, stipulating deadlines, that sort of thing. How do you get your point across in a meeting? So we talked about speaking up in a meeting, and all of what I said earlier is important, but you also need to be able to say, that you're clear about what your point is and why you're making it, that you use strong, unapologetic language, and you're succinct and to the point without waffling. Okay, so something to think about there. How do you ensure that you maintain good working relationships with your colleagues? And, meeting isn't even mentioned there, but so this would be around things like respecting everyone's viewpoint, making sure everyone is heard, not ignoring people, asking for others' thoughts and opinions, being clear that you're not agreeing with a particular point rather than attacking the person, thanking people for contributing, and then following up what actions that show that you're taking others' opinions into account. How do you ensure that every member of the team is allowed to participate? So, as well as what we've already talked about around making sure that each person gets a chance to speak, and indeed asking for each person's thoughts, you might want to include something along the lines of asking for opinions in writing, maybe ahead of the meeting or after the meeting as a follow-up, in order to make sure that those who are not always heard at meetings have a chance to put their ideas forward. Okay. Describe the personal skills needed to deal with conflict between other people. I think you need to be positive about your intent in dealing with conflict. And you will use things like active listening, empathy, patience, and calmness, as well as problem-solving skills. And the final one there, how do you impress in meetings? So obviously, all of the things that we've talked around, being prepared, respecting others, appropriate behaviours, and speaking up and making your points clearly. Okay, so now would be a good time if you've got any questions or thoughts on anything that we've covered there. And I am going to stop recording.